a reminder, Doctor, you're still under oath.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, Dr. Fowler, right before the break, we were discussing Mr. Floyd's heart and the contributions of Mr. Floyd's heart to his death. Did you form, in your opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, what you thought was the principal cause of Mr. Floyd's death?
Yes.
And what is that?
Cardiac arrhythmia due to hypertensive atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease during restraint.
Now, in terms of the other contributing factors to Mr. Floyd's death, did you, as a part of your review, make other considerations to things that may have contributed?
Yes, I did.
I'd like to discuss with you carbon monoxide, or CO. Okay. You've reviewed all of the videos in the case, correct?
I did.
Did you pay attention to where Mr. Floyd's head was positioned relevant to the squad car?
Yes, I did.
Which way was his face, nose, mouth facing?
His face was facing towards the vehicle, towards the rear of the vehicle, and directly towards the area where you would expect the tailpipe or tailpipes of a vehicle to be.
And let me just ask you, are you suggesting that Mr. Floyd died from carbon monoxide poisoning?
Absolutely not, no. Not a full carbon monoxide poisoning, no.
All right. Now, I'd like to, if the court could publish, and before the court does, the next slide has a screenshot from Officer King's body-worn camera at 20:24:09. Do you see that in front of you there?
I do not at this time, no.
Okay. How about now?
Yes.
All right. Your Honor, I have independently marked this single slide as Exhibit 1058. And based upon discussions with counsel, I'd move for its admission.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
1058 is received.
Permission to publish? All right. Dr. Fowler, based on your review of the videos and evidence, were you able to determine if the vehicle was running?
There was evidence that the vehicle was running.
What would that evidence consist of?
What I observed was a collection of fluid. I don't know if this is working. Maybe I'm doing it the wrong way. Collection of fluid.
Objection, Your Honor. May we approach?
Sure.
Back on.
Objections overruled.
Dr. Fowler, based on your general knowledge as a forensic pathologist, your personal experiences, what comes out of a car's exhaust?
Typically, we see the products of combustion. It's an internal combustion engine coming out the exhaust. And the major products of combustion are going to be water vapor, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and then a couple of other very small other particulate and minor gases that come out of the exhaust pipe.
Is carbon monoxide toxic?
It is an extremely toxic gas.
How does it act as a poison?
Carbon monoxide attaches to the hemoglobin in our red blood cells, and it attaches to those red blood cells more tightly than oxygen. So it competes for the same binding position on the hemoglobin that oxygen does. And since it is a better, and it binds more firmly, the oxygen can't displace it. So as the percentage of carbon monoxide bound to your hemoglobin in your bloodstream slowly goes up, you lose that portion of your oxygen carrying capacity. So if you have a 10% carbon monoxide saturation in your bloodstream, you've lost 10% of your oxygen carrying capacity.
Okay. Can that cause ultimately death?
When you get to levels way in excess of 50-60%, people typically, even young healthy individuals, will start to die. The issue is that people with significant heart disease and reduced capacity in their heart are going to be adversely affected earlier. And so there are certainly many examples in the literature of people dying in an environment where multiple people are exposed, but one person dies at, and I've seen this, less than 20%, and the others die at varying levels above that. So it's not universal that everybody will require to get to 60, 70, 80%. That's a young, healthy individual. But people with predisposing conditions who are vulnerable will die at much lower levels.
So in terms of the literature, are you familiar generally with the literature on carbon monoxide poisoning?
Yes.
Specifically, are you familiar with the paper by DeMaio and Dana on carbon monoxide poisoning in open spaces?
Yes, that is a paper that came out in the late 80s, I believe.
And is this here as a part of your PowerPoint, that article, or the title of that article?
This is the title sheet or title portion of that particular paper that was published by the two doctors, yes.
And that was in the late 80s, you said? CDC warnings on carbon monoxide in open spaces?
Yes.
Can you describe what this slide represents?
So this is the outdoor air recommendations. So we're talking about indoor air, outdoor air recommendations by the EPA, and recommending that individuals are not exposed to more than 9 parts per million for 8 hours. Anything above an 8-hour exposure puts you at risk of absorbing carbon monoxide, which can put you at risk of at least symptoms, if not more. And when you go up to 35 parts per million, so not much of an increase, that exposure limit drops to 1 hour.
So in terms of the CDC versus the EPA, what does the CDC say?
Well, they're both saying, just be careful of carbon monoxide regardless of your environment.
Are you familiar with the Consumer Product Safety Commission scale? Excuse me, the Consumer Product Safety Commission.
Yes.
Is that the information that you obtained for this case?
So this is the top of the page that they refer to, and if you go to the next slide, it actually says what it says on the page. And basically they're saying that most people will not experience any symptoms from a prolonged exposure to carbon monoxide between 1 and 70 parts per million. But some heart patients may experience an increase in chest pain. In other words, become symptomatic in that range. As CO levels increase and remain above 70 parts per million, symptoms become more noticeable and include headache, fatigue, and nausea. And once you get above 150 to 200 parts per million, people become disoriented, unconscious, and death are possible. So the higher the level, the more rapid and the more serious the potential consequences of exposure to a source of carbon monoxide is.
Are you also familiar with the World Health Organization standards?
Yes.
Is that the next slide?
So this is just again the header from their document. The relevant information is on the next slide. And they go a little further than the EPA, giving us more data. And what they do is they've got the same 9 parts per million for 8 hours. Their recommendation is not more than 26 parts per million for 8 hours, not the 35 that the CDC, the EPA has. At 52 parts per million, the risk of exposure issues occurs you get in 30 minutes at 52 parts per million, which is in that 1 to 70 range that the EPA said is okay. And then at 87 parts per million, 15 minutes is all it takes to start getting yourself into having absorbed a decent amount of carbon monoxide.
Now, you're not a mechanic, correct?
No.
All right. But are you aware of some just sort of general standards in terms of the emission of carbon monoxide by vehicles?
Yes, I am. It's part of the general knowledge that forensic pathologists have as to the different types of sources of carbon monoxide.
And would that include the California Air Resources Board?
Yes, this is one of the most strict automobile emission regulations.
And what does the regulations stand for?
So in California, and it's been adopted in about 14, 15 states around the country, so California has been copied by various other states. Some states have not copied it. I could not find any reference to Minnesota being a CARB state.
Okay.
So, but adopting the California stringent regulations, a vehicle may emit up to 1,200 parts per million of carbon monoxide from its exhaust.
And I'm going back to the prior slide. Where would that fall within the World Health Organization guidelines?
Well, they go up to 87. We're talking 1,200, so we're talking in excess of 10 times. 12,
Now-
13 times.
Now, again, you're not suggesting to the jury that Mr. Floyd died of carbon monoxide poisoning.
Not exclusively, no.
Okay. How would you be able to determine the role that carbon monoxide played in a particular death?
Typically, and the easiest way for a medical examiner to do that is to have the blood tested by a laboratory for what we call carboxyhemoglobin saturation. And it will come back from the laboratory giving us a percentage saturation.
To your knowledge, was Mr. Floyd's blood tested for carbon monoxide?
I could not find a reference to it now.
Now, the previous articles that we kind of looked at, the DeMaio, I think you said, from the late 80s, are there more recent studies on the effect of carbon monoxide exposure in open spaces?
Yes.
Is that this, oops,
Yeah.
no. May have gotten mixed in here.
I don't think I put this into the PowerPoint,
Oh, okay.
Mr. Nelson.
All right.
Yes, there's a recent study or case report that came out of Poland, where a taxi driver committed suicide by taking his vehicle, parking it in an open space, taking one of the mats out of the vehicle, putting it behind the vehicle, and then lay down on the mat and inhaled the exhaust. And he ended up with a very high level of carbon monoxide. It was in the 80s. Certainly sufficient to be an exclusive cause of death in that particular case. The interesting thing about that particular study was it provided no new information as carbon dioxide is dangerous. Carbon dioxide comes out of exhausts, and you can do this because it replicated what DeMaio and Dana had done 20 or 30 years before. But what was done in that particular case was that the authorities tested the amount of carbon monoxide coming out of the exhaust. So they did a recreation, reenactment, and took carbon monoxide sensors and put them at approximately the place where the man's nose and mouth were, and then monitored the carbon monoxide coming out of this vehicle. So the principle that you can test a vehicle and make a determination exactly how dangerous it is was properly tested in that particular case. And they found that when the breeze was blowing or the wind was blowing at or about this man's face, and he was about a foot away, to give you a reference, when the wind was blowing, the amount of carbon monoxide picked up by the sensor was 200 parts per million. And when the wind dropped, it went up to 790 parts per million, which is, again, almost 10 times the World Health Organization's recommendation. So in the area close to an exhaust, you're going to have a much higher level of carbon monoxide than you would if you're 3-4 feet away.
Okay. Now, to your knowledge, were similar experiments done in this case, or recreations?
I did not see any information that indicated or was done in this particular case, no.
In terms of modern vehicles, they have catalytic converters, correct?
Absolutely.
And what does a catalytic converter do relevant to carbon monoxide?
It reduces it dramatically. So in the era before catalytic converters, the amount of carbon monoxide coming out of a typical car exhaust would exceed 30,000 parts per million and could be as high as 70,000 parts per million. So the catalytic converter and the modern emissions controls that you see on, at least in the California requirements, which are again the most strict, have reduced it by about 30 times to somewhere close to 1,000 to 1,200.
Now, in terms of, can you describe for the jury what a pulse oximeter is?
Yes, a pulse oximeter is a device that you put on the finger. It's a little your pulse rate and the oxygen saturation in your blood. So it counts the pulses and it reads how much oxygen you're carrying in your blood by looking at the color of your fingernail.
How does carbon monoxide come into play in terms of pulse oximeter?
So the important thing is it appears to be oxygen. It changes the blood to a color which the pulse oximeter thinks is oxygen. So if you take somebody who has 50% saturation with carbon monoxide, it will still read that the person is 95% oxygen. It doesn't tell you that there's 50%. So if a pulse oximeter was put on Mr. Floyd's finger in the vehicle and again in the hospital, the pulse oximeter does not give us any information allowing us to say he was or was not under the influence of some degree of carbon monoxide intoxication.
How long does carbon monoxide typically stay in the bloodstream?
So it stays in the bloodstream if you want to treat a person and put them on 100% oxygen. The half-life is about 1.5 hours to 2 hours. If you're exposed to ambient air, it takes much longer to get rid of the carbon monoxide.
And so, I mean, essentially removing that carbon monoxide from the bloodstream is a reversible process.
It's not an irreversible blonde, it is reversible. So yes, it will at some point slowly dissociate and be blown off. We do generate a small degree of carbon monoxide as part of our normal metabolism. It's a very low, sub 1%, and it binds to the to the hemoglobin and eventually dissociates and is eliminated. So in small amounts, are not an issue, and yes, it will dissociate and be blown off at some point as part of the normal metabolism.
So how much carbon monoxide is needed to be absorbed into the bloodstream to diminish the oxygen supply?
Well, for a young, healthy individual, you want to probably exceed the 60, 70, 80% range. That's what we typically see. However, in individuals who have risk factors, that can be far, far less.
What type of risk factors would you look for?
So these are particularly, the individuals that are particularly at risk are people with cardiovascular disease, as we saw in Mr. Floyd, and people with chronic obstructive lung disease would also have a higher risk, and then other comorbidities, kidney disease, etc. But the real high-risk one is going to be heart.
And what percentage would you expect when someone presents with those conditions?
Very difficult to predict because everybody is different. There are studies out there where as little as 6% saturation with carbon monoxide in an individual who's exercising with heart disease will start causing arrhythmias. So it's a very low percentage. Now you have to have all of this, the heart disease and exercise. But at about 6%, there have been studies done in a controlled laboratory environment where people started showing EKG changes and premature ventricular contractions at about 6%. So it has potential to affect individuals at much lower levels than you would require for a young, healthy individual.
Now, in terms of findings at autopsy, are there certain things at autopsy that can determine the presence of carbon monoxide, or certain observations the pathologist can make?
Yes, typically carbon monoxide makes the blood appear, and the terminology, it looks like it's cherry red in color. It's not the standard pink or slightly darker red color that we would see for deoxygenated blood. It's a fairly bright cherry red color. Hence the reason the pulse oximeters get somewhat confused as well. Now, when you get levels of 50, 60, 70%, and the greater majority of the blood is carboxyhemoglobin, it stands out. But when you're looking at levels that are 10%, 20%, it doesn't, and is not easy to see. A typical smoker, 1 pack a day, will have and can have a carboxyhemoglobin of 6%. 2 packs a day, you can get up to 12%. We just don't see that as forensic pathologists because there is so much background color from the normal blood that it's lost in that. So I would expect a pathologist, when there is substantial amount, to spot it relatively easily, but I would not expect somebody to see the lower levels that can still be a factor.
And to do that, you would need to test the blood?
That would be the gold standard, yes. Test the blood and see how much carboxyhemoglobin is in the blood.
So if you're not saying that carbon monoxide caused Mr. Floyd's death, can you likewise eliminate it as a contributing factor?
The only way to eliminate carbon monoxide as a contributing factor would be to ensure that there was none in his blood or a very, very low level in his blood. So in Mr. Floyd, it robs him of an additional percentage of oxygen carrying capacity. Whether that be 5%, 10%, 15%, it takes away from the important factor of getting blood to his heart muscle. So this is just another potential insult, another brick in the wall, unfortunately, for the circumstances here.
Now, ultimately, the officers weren't affected by this.
No, they were not.
And why could that be?
Well, they're another 2 to 3 feet away, and potentially, hopefully, they're much younger, and hopefully don't have heart disease. So with every foot or more away, the amount of carbon monoxide in that particular bubble is going to decrease.
Now, so we've discussed the heart, we've discussed carbon monoxide. Did you eliminate certain causes of death as well?
Yes,
specifically referring to asphyxia.
correct.
How would you describe the investigation of custodial deaths compared to other types of deaths?
Very long, very complex, and something that needs to be done very, very carefully.
Are there many variables to consider?
Absolutely, there are huge number of variables, as we obviously can see in the case of Mr. Floyd as well.
Now, in terms of this article here in your PowerPoint presentation, what's the significance of this?
So this is an article that was put out, I think about 1992 by Dr. James Luke and Dr. Donald Ray. Dr. Donald Ray was one of the first pathologists to theorize that putting somebody in a face-down position was dangerous. And this was based on observations of cases where people were placed in a prone position and they died. And so his conclusion was that may well be a factor and needed to be considered. But what Dr. Ray also does say, and later on he recanted that to a large extent, but what he does say is that these are very difficult, complex cases. Don't rush to judgment. Make sure you've considered all of the potential issues that are at play in these particular cases. And they even talk about a crystal ball in this particular case, and the risk of underestimating the importance of common sense, and the fact that there are no easy answers in such deaths.
In your experiences as a forensic pathologist, have you had the opportunity to perform a death investigation and autopsies of in-custody deaths?
Yes.
So in this particular case, we've heard a lot about hypoxia. Which organ is more sensitive to hypoxia?
The brain is the most sensitive, or rapidly sensitive, to hypoxia.
In your review of the materials, did you have an opportunity to review some testimony of Dr. Baker in prior proceedings?
Yes.
Dr. Baker, in his testimony, referenced some studies in terms of the effects of positional asphyxia. Are you familiar with those studies?
Yes.
Did you take those studies into consideration as far as your analysis of this case?
Yes, that is the current state of the science or the knowledge base with regard to this very difficult situation.
So let's talk just simply about the prone position. Do people sometimes sleep in the prone position?
Yes, approximately 7% of the adult population sleep face down.
In terms of medical examinations, treatments, are people kept in the prone position?
In certain situations, people are examined in the prone position. There are therapeutic maneuvers where people are deliberately placed in the prone position. One of the best examples right now is COVID, where patients will be put in a prone position, which is face down, and it improves their ability for oxygen exchange, not decreases it. So, the prone position by itself does not have, or at least there is no evidence right now that is a significant issue.
In terms of this particular case, of course, the prone position is, not in a hospital setting, right? It's on a street, agreed?
Correct.
And just generally speaking, if a person were to lay down on the street in the prone position with nothing on top of them, is that in and of itself inherently dangerous?
No, the scientific studies basically have looked at the issue of the prone position with and without weight and made a determination that there really is no significant impairment of the individual's respiratory function. And those particular studies were very carefully crafted.
Let me just interrupt you for a second, Doctor. Can you just, what's the kind of the leading study on weight applied to someone in the prone position?
I think there are several, but the one that I've recently read, well not recently, but I know of, is the one by Dr. Mark Kroll, and a couple of other co-authors.
And is that paper here,
Yes, I believe that is the one, yes.
Positional Compression and Restraint Asphyxia, a brief review?
Yes.
Now, in terms of this study, can you just explain this study? Can you explain the setting of the study, etc.?
So this is a review paper where he refers to various papers, including his own work, where no evidence of any kind of compressional asphyxia was found in individuals who were in the so-called hog tie situation, which is prone with their hands handcuffed behind their backs, additional restraints applied around their ankles, and then the two tied together. That is the classical hog tie position. And then weights were applied to the individual up to 102 kilograms, which is 225 pounds, and found, again, no significant disturbance to their ability to exchange and breathe. And so the final conclusion was, and there are about 23 different studies out there that Dr. Baker referred to in his previous testimonies and a previous legal environment. And in this paper, Dr. Kroll says positional asphyxia, as the term is used in court today, is an interesting hypothesis, unsupported by any experimental data.
So let me ask you, pursuant to the court's order, you were permitted to review the testimony or watch the testimony of other expert witnesses in this case, correct?
Yes.
And did you do so?
Some of them, not all of them.
Okay. Did you hear criticism of this Kroll paper?
Yes, I did.
And do you think that the study was flawed based on its methodology?
So the study was asking one specific question: is the prone position dangerous? When you craft a experimental process to look at a particular process, in this particular case was the prone, you want to eliminate all other variables. You want to eliminate fear. You want to eliminate exertion. You want to eliminate environmental conditions other than, and focus entirely on that one entity. So agree that what is happening in this particular situation, they didn't use people who had heart disease. They used young, healthy volunteers. The surface they were lying on was not asphalt. It was a hard floor with a thin gym mat on it. The individuals were not in fear of their life. They knew that they could be pulled out of that at any time, and so there was no fear and hypersecretion of adrenaline and all of the other issues. All they simply were doing is evaluating just the prone position and the weight on the back from the prone position, and found that it had no effect. So now you can go back and look at the other issues if you want to at some stage.
Now, in terms of this study, by putting weight on the back, how did that work?
So they were using bags of weight, sacks, and they continued to place them over the thorax, evenly distributed across the chest and an upper abdominal area. The area which is where your lungs and the so-called bellows, and so it puts pressure because of the abdominal weight and on the chest, and it looks to see whether or not individuals can still move air in and out, and they did not find any significant impact.
Have you ever seen an image of like a baseball team winning the World